Another trend is that what we see is that actually we see that Japan's geographic development, we see that the number of deaths per year is growing and the number of births per year is decreasing. So that will lead to a decline in population, which will lead to a decline in our markets in Japan. So that is another thing that will drive more and more companies in Japan to look for international opportunities. Now, it's not that Japan has not done anything yet. Actually, they're already very much present. There are a lot of goods that are flowing, mostly goods, but also some services, but mostly goods that are flowing from Japan into the global markets. Actually, Japan has a market in a trade surplus versus many countries. So actually, Japan is already globalized to a certain extent. However, when we compare this to other OECD nations, that Japan as one of the leading economies in the world, I found this graph which comes from The Economist, and it compares basically. You need to look at the title of this graph. It's the percentage external to home country. So if you look at on the left side, you see revenues, ownership, assets, and management top 6 positions. So what does it mean if you look at these bar charts? That actually the percentage of revenues of Japanese companies, of the top 10 Japanese companies, but they look at the revenues, about 33%, about one third of all revenues of these companies comes from outside of Japan. If we compare that to the top 10 of the rest of the world, then it's about 50%. So the top 10 Japanese companies may have been globalized, they may have external reach, but compared to the rest of the world, they are still more domestic. The same is true for ownership. In the case of Japanese companies, about one quarter of ownership is in the hands of foreigners, whereas in companies outside of Japan, that is about half, about 50%. When we look at assets, it's 70% versus 44%, and if we look at the number of managers, the top 6 managers, so the CEO, the CFO, the COO, if you look at the top 6 managers, then we can see that actually also Japan has a very minor share of foreign executives compared to the rest of the world. That's also actually pretty minor. But as you can see, yes, Japan is globalizing, but not at the same pace as the top 10 companies in other parts of the world. So the world is not flat. Now, I'm not going to discuss this slide because you've seen it already like a gazillion times. It's more or less okay. Well, actually, we see cultural differences between Europe and Japan. So moving on to the next slide. So what does it mean if you actually engage in business outside of Japan? Actually, for Japanese people, and the same is true, by the way, for Europeans when they're doing business overseas, but stepping out of Japan means that you are actually stepping out of your comfort zone. Because basically when you arrive new somewhere in a foreign country, you have zero reputation as compared to Japan, where maybe based on the university you went to, or your experience that you went to, or the company that you work for is very reputable. When you go outside of Japan, that doesn't mean anything anymore, and basically you're more or less naked. It becomes even worse if you need to actually engage in business with people in a language that is not yours. So it's no longer, you can no longer be comfortable in the Japanese language that you speak fluently, but you need to do business in a language that is not yours. And on top of that, you will need to build relations, trust relations with people with a different cultural background, different habits, and different ways of thinking. So it's very easy to see that actually this is rather risky. It's rather it could be a very unpleasant experience to feel this naked. And this nakedness leads to a certain kind of conservatism, where we see that a lot of companies in Japan have been looking at the opportunities to globalize, but a lot of them have, after a study, after consideration, decided, no, we are not ready yet, or maybe in the future, but we're not going to do it. So this conservatism, I feel that is driven by this discomfort that many people will naturally feel when they do business outside of Japan. And the Japanese market is still rather big, but it's shrinking, and therefore, due to postponement, we see that a lot of companies feel that, okay, so now we have postponed it maybe for too long, and then the opposite starts to happen. Basically, people, they take an all or nothing approach, and they kind of like plunge into the unknown, plunge into the dark, making huge investments that are very risky for the future of their company. And we have some very high profile cases where this went wrong. For example, Toshiba, who jumped into the nuclear market, into the global nuclear market, by acquiring Westinghouse, which was a very risky acquisition because it could kill them. And actually, it literally did kill them. Not entirely, but they're almost, well, they are very severely damaged goods at the moment. Another example is Kirin. Kirin, who went into their first investment outside of Asia, was in Brazil, investing $4 billion in a market that they did not really know, the language that they didn't really speak. They invested in Brazil, and within 2-3 years, they actually had to write off $3 billion when they left Brazil after a failed adventure. So basically, it's a very big risk to postpone and not take a stepwise approach when you're going to globalize, a step-by-step approach when you're going to globalize. So instead of taking a giant leap of faith, it's better to globalize step by step. Okay, the first step is finding and contacting your customers or partners. Actually, that is rather easy today because we have the internet. We have lots of companies who help us to do that. There are a lot of companies who are willing to actually do research for you, to explore the market. We have Google. Basically, information is more or less freely available. So finding potential customers, finding potential suppliers, it has become a lot simpler. But what about the next step? Basically, the next step, then you will need to get out of your comfort zone and actually start to engage directly with your with foreigners. And that's when we will see that there are language gaps, cultural gaps, business practice gaps. So then the question is, okay, how to gain their trust, how to communicate, how to present and negotiate, and how to actually keep all your risks under control. And this is actually where you're more or less on your own. This is where it really becomes tricky. And this is basically where this program is trying to help you, participants of big Japanese companies who are going to pay us lots of money for training, right, Musa?